Hi, today we're going to be demonstrating the Weather Workbook from Visual Crossing. The Weather Workbook is a Microsoft Excel workbook that allows you to query directly into the Visual Crossing weather server and pull back weather data directly into your workbook. And this is given out as an example workbook to our customers that can be utilized both as just as a data query tool. But it also could be customized if you build in your own workbook UI for other users so that they can also query weather data. Or it can be used as a technical starting point or tutorial for folks who are getting interested in how to query weather data through the Power Query functionality of Microsoft Excel. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you're on the Visual Crossing webpage, visualcrossing.com, click on the Weather Data button in the center. And immediately you'll see that we have three options for downloading weather data. The first is the actual download page, which is a web-based interface that allows you to enter in your credentials, define a query. These are my locations. I want forecast data, and then download the data in the format that you want it. And that usually comes in the form of CSV. It also will possibly give you a URL if you're interested where you can query it from other business systems. So you have two different ways to grab that data. One is download it through CSV, the other is to grab it through the URL. And that's the system that we're going to be using here today is downloading through the URL, but we're going to be doing it directly from Excel, but through the web URL. The second section here is all about the Excel integration, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. And the final section here is about the API. So if you want code examples, how to script from Python to pretty much anything, how do I pull data through the API, documentation on the API and the settings, all of that is in this section over here. We're going to go to the Excel section, and you'll notice that there's three ways to work within Microsoft Excel with Visual Crossing. One is through the web query connection. Again, it's going to use a URL web-based query through the RESTful API to grab data and pull it into Excel. So we will be utilizing this format of work. The second way is to just simply, from the previous download page I was discussing, download as a CSV, and you can simply import it into Excel or a relational database or anywhere else as CSV, and it's very straightforward and very simple. And the final way is the add-in. Visual Crossing is one of the only weather data providers to offer an add-in on the Microsoft App Source store. It's free to download. You do need credentials to log into the add-in as well, so you will need to be licensed or have a trial. But it does offer some great functionality. The big advantage for the add-in is that you can have a group of cells that have your weather locations. And let's say you have 1,000 addresses of customers that you want to send something to, and you want to check the weather before you send it. You could simply use the Excel add-in to define that range of cells and pass it to Visual Crossing and get the weather back, and it will be joined right into your cells right there. And so you have a single data set that doesn't need to be joined. It's been merged and matched with weather data. The downside typically to add-ins is that you have to have the version support, Excel 2016 or greater, or you have to have the distribution capability. If you have a lot of users on your system and they all have to have the same add-in, they'd have to download it and install it, and you have to manage it that way. So there's pros and cons. Today we'll be talking about the Weather Workbook, which is an alternative to the add-in, and so we'll be going through that. To do this, let's first download it. So we'll scroll down the page a little bit and you'll see Try Weather Workbook. This is a link to a blog, which is a tutorial style blog, which tells you all about the Weather Workbook. We highly encourage that you read through this, and in addition to following through this video, we'll try to cover most of the material here, but there's some good detailed information as well as links to things like the Weather API documentation as well as the weather data definitions that you can click on here and see exactly what does average temperature mean. And how is it defined, how is it created. Those are all great pieces of functionality that you should be familiar with. As you get down a page or so, you'll see Download the Weather Workbook. If you click on that link, you'll notice in our browser It's downloaded this location for us. And if we want to go to that location, you see we have that Visual Crossing weather workbook there. And then we could just go ahead and open it in Excel. So this is the weather workbook. It consists of 5 sheets that you'll see at the bottom in the form of tabs. The first of which is an introduction. It's a lot of what we're discussing here in terms of where do things exist and how do I make a query, as well as some of the other nitty-gritty details. But it also has some important links here for you to follow through with, and you can click over to. So I highly recommend that you read this as well when you're first getting started. The first functional page that we have here is the weather query sheet. And the weather query sheet, you'll see the areas in green allow you or your users to enter in data that define the query. The section at the left here is allowing you to enter in the locations that you want to fetch weather for. As you see, they could be address strings, or they could just be names of cities, or they could even be zip codes. Anything that our geocoder can match, and you can find those on our support page, it will do so. And this capability here is unique to Visual Crossing in 2 different ways. One is that in a single query on our API, you can pass in multiple locations. Almost all other weather query systems require you do one at a time, and so when the data comes back, you have to join it in the right locations and after you do the fetch. With Visual Crossing, you can fetch whatever it is up into your query limit that allows you to fetch that many locations. And so for us, this is very valuable, especially when you're using Excel. And the part 2 of that is that you'll notice that I'm not providing lat longs here, which is what most weather systems require. We're actually passing in string data that defines addresses and locations. We have an integrated geocoder, which is basically what turns address information into mappable locations, such as lat long. And so we allow you to do multiple, and we also allow you to do these different various strings, whereas our system will grab each one, match it up, get the weather for it, and then return it. You do that all in a single query, which is quite powerful and very useful, especially when you're working in Excel, where you just have string data and you don't have nicely cleansed, formatted data with lat long for every location that you have. All right. So the other locations that we have here, the other editable locations, for history, if you're making a history query, you'll need to give us a start and end date. You'll notice that for the end date, we've defined, basically it's listed as today -1, which starts as yesterday. So, and then the start date is basically the beginning of February. And so users can enter in any date going back, again, 30 or 40 years is usually pretty reliable in terms of modern weather systems. Visual Crossing does have the capability of going back 100 years, but some of that data, just the way it was collected back then, isn't always necessarily reliable, and people don't always necessarily need that unless you're doing some sort of historical research. Users enter in their dates in the green, and they enter in their locations. And that's pretty much all they need. The one thing that you will need to do to set up the weather workbook, though, is enter your API key here in this section right here. And the way you do that is if when you back on your web page here, and if you remember this page here, the weather page, the easiest way to get there is to click onto the download weather page. It'll ask you to log in or sign up for a free trial. You can do either. API is supported across all our license levels currently, so everybody should have access to it. Once you sign in and you click on the account button here, it will show you your API key, and it'll have a copy button as well. So just click copy on that, and once you have your API key, you paste it into here, and then you're good to go. Your whole query system is activated. So basically, this is what you need to get started. Change your dates, change your locations, and you're immediately making queries. All of these other settings are very useful, but not necessary. And oftentimes you'll find that maybe for your end users, you may want to hide these, and you may want to move these locations. So to do that, one of the things you'll notice is that if you click on any green section that has data entry, you notice in the upper left corner they have named locations. So this range of one cell is named format start date, and this query system knows that name and looks for it wherever it resides. So if you wanted to move these dates, you could just simply cut, not copy, but cut and paste into another location in the workbook. Could be your own custom sheet or the data sheet or something like that. And when the user enters into that, it would be just the same as if they had entered here. You're actually moving this cell to another location, but the Visual Crossing query system knows how to reference it, and so it'll send it in the right with the right dates. So that's the initial way that you could customize if you wish to do so. All of the data down here is typically more advanced user settings. Those settings are weather units. Do you want to do it in US, UK, metric? Depends on whether you're doing research or whether you're doing standard weather analysis, but you get to choose your own standard of measures there for that. The hour aggregation levels, there's 3 of them. You could say hourly, in which case you change this value to 1, and this is all defined right here at the right, and the pop down will only allow certain numbers. If you define 12, it'll do day-night. It'll give you 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. weather. And if you do 24, it'll aggregate it into daily weather. So if I only want daily sums, you'd enter the number 24 here. The final setting, it comes in the 2 forms, is your day start and end time. If you have the right license level, it's typically called business hours. So the feature in Visual Crossing is this: if you're a business and you want to understand how rain affects your business, you may not care if it rains overnight. You do care if it rains your business opening time or an hour before, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And so you could define 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and the system will adapt for you. It won't download hourly data outside of that time, and it will treat the 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. as a day unit. So when it's aggregating daily, which is 24 hours typically, it will aggregate only the hours it returns, which is incredibly valuable for businesses, both to be smarter but download less data as well. It's a nice feature for those that need it. And one of the things I'll say about both the aggregation system and the day start and stop, it's about customizing your day. We also have what's called automatic time zone conversion. One of the things other weather systems don't offer is the fact that they will return everything in GMT time, and you have to do the conversion. And it's not very straightforward, because daylight savings times, how far you are away from GMT, all of those things need to be calculated carefully, because they change when you're querying history data. Let's say daylight savings changed back in 1980s, and you need to account for that. Well, the system does that for you. So when it's aggregating days and it's trying to pick out the right hours for you, it knows how to adjust the time and does it on your behalf. And so it's a very powerful feature of the Visual Crossing system as a whole. It's something you just don't even have to worry about here. Again, unless you want to go back to GMT, there's a advanced setting for that as well, in which case you say just only give me GMT. But for most users, they want in their time zone, they want 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. depending on what daylight savings version they're in, and everything is accounted for. All right, so let's get into the query itself and some of the data. So basically, let's just make a quick change here, and we will change Miami to Chicago, Illinois, just to make sure. And rather than querying from February 1st, we'll go to the beginning of the year, January 1st, and we'll go through yesterday. So now we made a couple changes. So we'll go to the third sheet, which is our history data. So now, we've mentioned before that everything's set up through the Power Query system. A query you can think of as an object in your workbook, which is basically has a definition of where do I call, how do I call out to get the query, and then where do I put the data. And this grid that you're looking at is actually the results section tied to the query. If I right click anywhere on this grid and I click refresh, it will grab those input controls that I changed, and it'll go out and fetch, and you'll see it brought back Chicago, Herndon, and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for me. And so now I have all my updated weather data. If you look at our blog, there's a link to how to set up refreshes. You could set up the refresh so that it'll re-query every single time you open a workbook. You could build custom buttons in there to click refresh. There's all sorts of different times and capabilities, and you can do it on a timer. How often does it refresh the data for you? So the refresh doesn't have to be manually as we're doing here, but just keep that in mind for your own use case. But now we have basically the result of all our data. So let's take a quick look at this query just so you can see. If you go over to the data page and you click on queries and connections, you'll see the history queries on this page, and if you mouse over it, it will show you a lot about what columns it's bringing back and when it was last updated. And if you click on edit, and you can also right click on this and hit edit as well, it brings up the definition of the query, and you can even go into the advanced editor and see the text. And you can see how it uses the names inside the workbook to make the query to pull back CSV data, and it makes a weather query, which we'll show you in a little bit, and it passes it through and gets the data back. And so that's how it does the parameterized query for history. It's pulling data out of the cells that you define, bundling it up into a string, passing it across, getting the data, putting the data into columns, and putting it into this format for you. And so we have our weather data back. And this is our history. If we click on the next sheet over, it's the same thing. Previously we had only queried Miami, so let's hit a refresh on this. And you notice the locations that we put in, Chicago, Herndon, and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We now have the forecast for each of the next 15 days for all of the different weather variables. And this was brought back instantly by the query for you. So now, again, simply by changing a location or changing a date, you can update and get this data and utilize it however you want. Make it part of your own workbook, or copy and paste it out, or save it, whatever you'd like to do. Again, we have blogs on this and everything. If you need any help though, be sure to contact us. You can mail us at info@visualcrossing.com with general questions. If you have support questions on this, support@visualcrossing.com. Just feel free to email us anytime, and we'd be happy to help you get started. If you need help modifying or you get lost in the process of the query, let us know. But we hope you enjoy the weather workbook. It's a very powerful way of just pulling weather straight back and not having to go to any other sites and downloads or anything like that. You don't have to know how to code, you don't have to know how to script, you don't have to know any of that. All you have to know how to do is enter data into Excel cell values, and the data will come back in the format that you need it. So hope you enjoyed this video. Please send us your feedback and any questions that you have. Thank you very much.